Okay, in this tutorial, we're going to talk about white balance settings. So again, when you're, doing imaging, and primarily I'm speaking on a prosumer or pro level camera where you have access to ISO, aperture, shutter speed, so basically fully manual setting. When you're working fully manual, it gives you complete control over, how the image is going to be created, even in its raw format. Some cell phones do have the ability to adjust exposure, but not by shutter speed and not by aperture, by a slider. And then some point and shoots do have aperture and shutter speed changing capability, but they're limited. Usually the aperture is very limited. They start at like f4 and only go up to like f11, and then the shutter speeds only work in full stop increments. They don't have eighth stops or quarter stops. But in the pro cameras, you usually have eighth stops, quarter stops, full stops, and then for aperture settings, that's usually dependent upon your prime lens or your telephoto lens. Prime lens is usually having some faster speeds, like your 50 millimeters can go down to 1.8, and your zoom lenses usually sometimes top out at 2.8 for faster lenses, so you have some limitations there as well. But let's just be talking here about prosumer and pro level cameras because those functions are becoming more and more capable in point and shoots and on cell phones. So white balance settings. In the next image sequence I have here, I have an incorrect white balance setting set in a fluorescent room. So usually I have my RAW file set to automatic because in Adobe Camera Raw, based on your camera settings, you can change white balancing after the fact. So white balancing really doesn't matter in camera unless you're in a studio setting and you have something calibrated or set up, then obviously you have that custom setting on your camera, so you might as well take care of it in camera first. But let's say you didn't do that, or you're shooting outdoors, or some lighting changed, or an unexpected lighting situation came up, and you didn't realize it while you were shooting because things get busy and hectic in photo shoots, and you could forget it. Well, Camera Raw came to save the day, and it's changeable after the fact. So I'm going to select these two images that are incorrect white balance settings, and I'm going to open them up in Camera Raw using the Command R function. And when I'm in Camera Raw, you can see here one of the first settings that you have in your General tab, your General Editing tab, is white balance. So currently it says as shot. So what that means is what your camera was set to. So in this case, I can't remember off the top of my head what I had set, but it's as shot. So I can check that in Adobe Bridge if I wanted to. But basically, I click the drop-down menu. Now this drop-down menu will change based on your camera. So pro cameras have custom settings and varied white balance settings that you can choose. So based on the pro model, based on the prosumer model, you may have different settings than I do here. But basically, there's the auto function from the 5D and all of the regular the white balance settings, and then a custom setting I must have set up at some other time. So you can choose and just go through the list as if you were in camera and changing them. So when I set it to auto, that is what my auto function would be. And the auto function in this particular camera and most models after it, they do a really good job. There is some instances I've seen with my 5D and other 5D like Mark II, Mark III, that sometimes when you're shooting in shade, shade is a challenging thing because shade is actually out in daylight, but those of you who do photography understand that in the shaded area, there is usually a blue cast. So sometimes auto function has a little bit of a problem with that. It makes the image too cool. And I mean cool like in a blue tone and has other effects, but again, all camera manufacturers and all the algorithms that play out their auto functions, that's going to depend on the camera model and make. So basically, it doesn't really matter if it's shooting in RAW because then you have the ability to change it. So I can go through and change it and find the one that works. So I do know that I'm in a fluorescent setting, but all fluorescent bulbs are not the same. So it's possible that the facilities person in this particular room used 7 different fluorescent bulbs to put in the fluorescent ballasts. So even though I select the fluorescent setting, it may not be perfect. You may see a weird cool cast or a weird green cast or whatever it may be, and that is up to you as an editor to determine. So if you're doing it for a graphic design project, you determine it based on the colors you need, and you would white balance based on what you need and what is appropriate. And also, there could be some images where you weren't even there. So if it's a sunset, you really don't know what the sunset looked like. So when you're color balancing a sunset in Camera Raw, that is a subjective decision. Because unless you were standing in that place, you saw the sunset, but all of you know that everybody sees things differently. So even if there was 10 people at a sunset, everybody technically saw it differently. But nonetheless, fluorescent setting can work, but sometimes I will go there because it could just get you in the pocket. You're like, okay, well, that's not terrible, but let's say you didn't have a color card like I do in this photo, and let's say you forgot your gray card or whatever color balancing tool you use. There's a number of them on the market. Those are great for getting you in the pocket, like I just said. They get you in the pocket for the color temperature of traditional fluorescent settings and the color temperature and tinting of that temperature, and then you can make adjustments to that as needed. But in this case, auto does a pretty good job on my camera. It actually balances the white much better, and you can use the color card to look at that, and we'll get into the color balancing tool up above, how you use color cards to do that. But basically, just letting you know, you can change white balancing after the fact. So that is something that is completely non-destructive as opposed to ISO. So then I can come here to this one and then do the same. Choose auto, and then you can see when I switch between them, there is a slight difference, right? There's a slight difference in the tint, but a +1 difference in my tint is almost visually imperceptible. So if someone was looking at this image separately and then like a few seconds later you showed them this image, they probably couldn't tell the difference. But you can see it's judging it by my camera. So my camera does a pretty good job maintaining auto even after a few seconds in exposure. And then you can even go to fluorescent and see if there's a difference in that. So if I do fluorescent, you can look at the difference. And you can see fluorescent isn't that far from the auto function. The auto function is just 100 kelvins different and just one tint value different. So pretty close. And when you're thinking of the human eye and how much we can discern, that really depends on physiology and quality of person's vision. I think that's it for white balance. So if you have any questions, just shoot me an email and let me know.